Stories never heard before. The Archivist of Unnamed Women. In a quiet town, where the wind often carried forgotten songs, stood an ancestral house, 3 stories tall, with latticed windows, and a door that hadn't been opened in decades. The house belonged to the Joshi family, once known for their astrologers and traders. But the youngest descendant, Seema Joshi, was neither. She was a librarian, drawn to forgotten things. When her grandmother passed away, Seema inherited the house. She arrived with a suitcase, a notebook, and a question she'd never dared ask: why were the women in our family never named in the family tree? Inside the house, Seema found portraits of men, bearded, turbaned, and proud. The women were present only in fragments: a hand on a shoulder, a sari edge, a blurred silhouette. She asked the caretaker, "Where are the women?" He said, they were remembered in whispers, but never written into the lineage. Their lives were lived, but not recorded. That night, Seema dreamed of a mirror that refused to show her face. Instead, it showed a woman, with ink-stained fingers, whispering, "Find the archive. We are waiting." The next morning, Seema wandered into the courtyard, and found a willow tree, ancient and knotted. Beneath its roots, wrapped in red cloth, was a brass key, and a small copper plate, etched with words, "For the one who finds what was never told." She unlocked the forbidden room. It was dim, dust-laced, and filled with scrolls, diaries, and bundles of cloth, not woven, but wrapped around objects. A broken comb, a rusted pen, a small vessel of dried turmeric. Each item held a story. One diary belonged to a woman, named Deepti Joshi, dated 1903. It read, "We are the unnamed. But we were never erased from existence. We pressed our stories into silence." Seema began decoding the archives. She discovered a woman, who taught village girls to read, disguised as a cooking class. A healer, who used turmeric and poetry to treat depression. A widow, who created a secret map of safe houses for women fleeing abuse. A girl, who documented her dreams in a cipher only her sister could read. And a mother who buried her grief in the folds of her prayer cloth, leaving behind a single line, "I was here." None of these women were in the family tree. But they were in the walls, in the objects, and in the rituals. Seema started a new practice. Every evening, she'd light a candle, and read one story aloud. She called it, the ritual of reclamation. She didn't publish the stories. She didn't start a podcast. She simply invited women from the town to listen. One woman wept when she heard the story of a midwife who saved her grandmother. Another brought her daughter, and said, "She needs to know we women existed." Over time, the house became a gathering place. Not for tourists, but for memory. Seema added a new branch to the family tree. It didn't have names. It had symbols: a thread, a flame, a mirror, a pen. The stories began to change her. She started noticing things she hadn't before. A woman at the market, who always looked over her shoulder, a girl who never spoke, unless spoken to. An elder who hummed lullabies, with no known origin. Seema began to wonder how many stories were still hidden, not in archives, but in gestures, silences, and routines. She began collecting oral fragments. Not interviews, just moments. A sentence overheard. A sigh. A pause before someone said, "Nothing." She wrote them down in a separate notebook titled, "Unsaid." One day, a young woman came to the house, with a bundle of cloth. Inside was a small mirror, cracked at the edge, and a note that read, "This belonged to a woman from our family. She never married. She never spoke of her past. But she always looked into this mirror, before she prayed. Seema placed the mirror beside the vessel of turmeric. She didn't ask for more. She simply wrote, "A woman who saw herself," before she spoke to the divine. Another day, an elderly man arrived with a wooden box. Inside were letters, written by his mother to none, in particular. They were never sent. They spoke of longing, of fear, of a love that had no place to land. He said, "I don't know what to do with these. But, I think you might." Seema read each letter slowly, then placed them in a drawer labeled, "Unsent." She didn't interpret them. She let them breathe. Sometimes, she sat in the archive for hours, without touching anything. Just listening. The silence had its own language. It spoke in the creak of the floorboards, the shift of light, and, in the scent of old paper. She began to notice how memory lived in the smallest things. Chipped cups. Faded ribbons. A half-written recipe. She started placing these objects in a new cabinet, one without labels. She called it, the Cabinet of Quiet Evidence. Visitors began leaving things behind. A hairpin. A torn photograph. A scrap of fabric. No explanations. One afternoon, a girl came with a folded paper. It had no words. Just a single fingerprint, pressed in ink. Seema placed it, in the cabinet, and whispered, "You were here." Another day, a woman arrived, with a small wooden box. Inside was a pair of anklets, one broken, one intact. She said, "My sister wore these, the day she left home. We never saw her again. I don't know what happened. But I want her, to be remembered." Seema placed the anklets beside the mirror. She didn't ask for the sister's name. She simply wrote, "A woman who walked away, and was never returned," to the story. The archive began to breathe differently. It was no longer, just a room. It became a listening space. A place where silence was not emptiness, but presence. Sometimes, Seema would sit by the window, and watch the light move across the floor. She imagined the women, whose stories she had found, how they might have stood in that same light, how they might have whispered to the walls, how they might have waited to be seen. She began writing small verses, not for publication, but for the archive itself. She called them whispers. One read. She was not erased. She was paused. Waiting, for someone to press play. Another read. Her name was never spoken. But her breath still lingers, in the folds of the curtain. Seema placed these verses in envelopes, and tucked them into corners of the house. Behind a bookshelf. Beneath a drawer. Inside a hollow step. She wanted the house to speak, even after she was gone. One evening, a young boy came with his grandmother. He didn't say much. But before leaving, he placed a small stone on the windowsill. It had a single word carved into it, "Listen." Seema held the stone in her hand, for a long time. Then, she placed it in the center of the archive. She began to wonder, if remembrance was not just about stories, but about gestures. About the way, someone enters a room. About the way, someone leaves a silence behind. She started a new notebook titled, "The Way They Moved." In it, she described the way women walked, paused, turned their heads, and held their hands. She wrote. She always looked left, before speaking. As if checking, whether her truth was allowed. She lingered near windows, not to look out, but to remember what it felt like to be on the other side. She kept her eyes on the entrance, so that she could see everyone who arrived. These were not biographies. They were movements. Echoes, traces. Years passed. The house aged gently, like a body that had begun to exhale. Seema continued her ritual, even when none came to listen. She believed the walls were listening. One winter evening, she wrote her final diary entry. For those who may think of me, as a healer, I just want to say, I did not heal the lineage. I simply refused to forget it. She placed the diary beside the vessel of turmeric, wrapped it in cloth, and tucked it into the archive. Before leaving the house, Seema carved a stone, and placed it at the entrance. It bore no names, only a single line etched in English. To the women, who were never written about, but who wrote everything. The stone was not a monument. It was a marker, a quiet declaration, that remembrance had occurred, not through triumph, but through presence. As Seema walked away from the house, she did not look back. She didn't need to. The stories had already begun to walk forward. But something stirred in her, an ache, a question, a pull. She kept wondering, were there other stories, like these? Stories, that none knew about? Stories, that too were hidden behind walls? Shouldn't she look for other places, where the women weren't named? Wouldn't that also be an act of remembrance? Something that others should be aware of? And then, she decided, this is not the end. This is just the start to something bigger, something that must unfold, not for praise, not for reward, but for honoring the lives of those, whose memories lay hidden, and were never publicly named.